Hi everyone, Janie here. Welcome back to my garden. So this is week 12 Master Gardener's Training recap. Yes, week 12. I only have 2 more classes left. 2 more classes left. So it's a 16-week course, at least in my county. But next week we actually don't have class because of Cesar Chavez Day. And then we have 2 more classes, and then we have 2 classes for presentations. So we do have to do a class presentation, a 30-minute presentation on a topic. You do have to work with a partner. I am working with my partner. We are doing the cool flower method, of course, right? She is another cut flower lover, and she is doing her own cut flowers, and we are introducing the topic of cool flowers to my Master Gardeners class so that they can answer. The point is that we can learn as much as possible so that we can answer as many questions for the public as we need. So my partner and I will be doing a video, and depending on how it turns out, I might post it on this channel, maybe as like a Saturday video or something. So we will see. I haven't decided yet. So next week there will be no Master Gardeners Training recap, just so you guys know. All right, so this is week 12 of my Master Gardeners Training, and our focus today was weeds, weed management and weed identification. And the most, if I could boil down the whole class to one thing, it would be weed identification. That was the most important part of the class because you have to know what you're dealing with to be able to deal with it correctly. Because there are a lot of ways to deal with weeds that are going to be, and I'm generalizing here, but they're going to be a complete waste of your time just based on the way the weed grows and the weed reproduces. You could be doing something that is just a complete waste of your time. So what are weeds? Weeds are in the eye of the beholder. A weed is just a plant that's in a spot that you don't want it, right? So to one person, a dandelion might be a weed. To another person, it might be a source of food. So we can't say all things are, this is definitely a weed. Weed is definitely in the eye of the beholder. But there are characteristics to certain plants that make them more weedy than other plants. And these characteristics are really important because they kind of affect how we are going to manage these type of weeds. And these biological components or biological advantages that make these weeds so invasive are things like rapid growth. There's some weeds, we know how fast, you could go out one day and have nothing, and the next day you can have a full grown weed and you don't even notice. Quick maturation. So there's certain weeds that will grow and set seed within 2 weeks, right? And compare that to another plant that might take 2 months to mature. And so that weed that matures in 2 weeks is going to be able to spread so much faster than the other plant that takes 2 months. Multiple reproductive strategies is probably the key one. So setting seed and spreading seed is a reproductive strategy for a weed. But then weeds will also use their roots, they'll use rhizomes, they'll use tubers to spread, right? And so there are certain things that we do for weed management that might not address all those reproductive strategies. So it's really important to know what type of weed you're dealing with and know what reproductive strategy that weed uses, so that if you just mow it, it might not do anything because it's still going to grow from the rhizomes underneath the ground. So that's something that we have to think about of weeds. And it's kind of what I'm talking about completely wasting your time on, for mowing something like that, because it's just going to grow back. Then another thing to think about as a characteristic for weeds is their high dormancy of their seeds, right? So they found common lamb's quarter seeds, which is a type of weed. They found that the seeds can lie dormant for 1,700 years. 1,700 years, that seed can be dormant, and then when it gets the right conditions, it can spring to life and it can start growing again after 1,700 years. And they had a whole list of a whole bunch of different weeds. And if you think even 30 years is absolutely crazy. Here in California, we've been in drought since 2020, right? So that's about 3 years. So you have to think, if a seed has a dormancy period longer than 3 years, and it hasn't had good, it's had droughty conditions and it hasn't had good conditions. Now this winter, we've had so much rain, so that weed seed is like, oh, great, I'm gonna start growing. And you know, it survived the 3 years of droughty conditions. And that's actually what's happening here in California, is we are being inundated, not only with rain, but also with weeds. And that is, you know, I've had a lot of questions about people asking about my flower field. It's more like a weed field right now, honestly. It's more like a weed field. And, you know, I have been out there and weed whacking and all that kind of stuff, but the amount of rain that we've had, every single seed that was in that seed bank, a seed bank is, the level of soil that has the weed seeds mixed in. Every single seed that had been sitting there dormant for the past 3 years has sprung to life. And so I am kind of waiting for things to warm up a little bit, then I can go there and I can weed whack and I can manage the weeds a little bit better. Because right now I'm losing the battle in my flower field, sadly. But after this weed class, I understand why, so it makes me feel a lot better about the situation. So the high dormancy of seeds for the weeds, for certain types of weeds, makes them that much weedier. All right, so plant identification is key, right? You need to know what type of plant, what type of weed you're dealing with in your garden to be able to address it appropriately. And there's a lot of different reasons why, but I would say, just to kind of boil it down to as simple as possible, there are annual weeds and there are perennial weeds. And all annual weeds grow and reproduce from seed. So basically they grow, they set seed, and then the seed spreads, and that's how the annual weeds reproduce and spread, right? So an annual weed like that, if you cut it, if you pull it, if you hoe it, if you mow it down, if you spray an organic herbicide on it before it sets seed, you're going to kill that annual weed, right? It's going to be done. It's going to be taken care of. Well, then there's perennial weeds, right? And these are the tough guys. These guys, they have their root system. They have a bunch of carbohydrate stores in their root system, and they can spread by rhizomes. They can spread by tubers. They can spread by their roots. There's so many things that they can spread by. Plus, they also spread by seeds, right? So they have multiple reproductive mechanisms, right? And if you don't know that you're dealing with a perennial weed that spreads by tubers, and you go out there and you hoe them down, right? They're just going to pop back up because they have all those carbohydrate stores in their tubers. And so again, you're losing the battle of these weeds because you're not understanding what type of weeds you're dealing with. It might work really well with this annual weed over here. It might do absolutely nothing with this perennial weed over here. So weed identification is of the utmost importance. And that was what the majority of my Master Gardener's class was all about, was about weed identification. And, you know, there's lots of ways to identify. You know, you pick out the characteristics. Do they flower? Do they have milky sap? Do they have spines? All that kind of stuff. Let's make it as simple as possible. There are apps that you can use. So there is Weed Scientists Association of America. Yes, there is a group of weed scientists, and they all got together and they did studies on these plant identification apps that we use all the time on our phones, and they picked the best ones that were the most effective in identifying weeds. And I'll tell you guys, the 3 best ones that they found were the most useful and identified it the most time. Now, let me tell you, it's not going to be 100% because these are crowdsourcing apps. So when you have crowdsourcing, you get bad information from people who don't know what they're talking about, right? So what these apps will do is they'll be like, okay, I'm 75% sure it's this weed. And then what you need to do is you need to take that information and you need to go look it up yourself. You need to go Google it and be like, yeah, that is a dandelion. I think they're right. Or yeah, that is a milk thistle. I think they're right. So the 3 best apps are PlantNet, iNaturalist, and Picture This. And they found, based on their studies, they found that the Picture This is the best app, the most correct, the most amount of times app that you can get. So I think all three of those apps are free. I don't think you have to pay. One thing I will say is Picture This. I think that was the one. When you sign up, it will make it look like that you have to subscribe. But if you look in the top right, one of my classmates told me this. If you look in the top right, you can click cancel, or you can X out of the subscription page, and then it takes you to the app, and you can use the app just regularly and not pay for that. I didn't know that. That is why I never used Picture This. I actually deleted Picture This from my phone because I thought the Picture This app you had to pay for, but you don't. You just have to press cancel. They definitely trick you. And then PlantNet is really good. And then iNaturalist is really cool because not only does it identify weeds and plants, but then it also identifies insects, and it identifies animals and trees, and all that other kind of stuff. I haven't played with iNaturalist yet, but I am planning to. I've already downloaded it on my phone. In my Master Gardeners class, I was using Picture This to identify. We had like a lab, like a practical. We went outside and they flagged a whole bunch of weeds around the parking lot, and we went and we had to identify each of the weeds. And I used the Picture This app, and I got every single one correct. Okay, so once you've identified your weed, you can actually go to an IPM website. Again, I'm going to say it again, the UC IPM website. For those of you who live in California, I'm sure all of you in other states have your own IPM website that you can check out. But you can actually go and look up the weed that you've identified, and it will tell you how to deal with it. If it's an annual weed, if it's a perennial weed, and then the best way to manage it to get rid of it the least toxic way possible, right? So it's going to be different if you're going to have a weed, let's see, a crabgrass, right? Which is a summer annual that you can just pull and be done with it, right? You don't even have to think about it. But then if you have a yellow nutsedge, which is a perennial, it's dormant in the winter. If you pull a nutsedge, you're gonna leave some of the roots, like you're going to leave some of the roots. And so it's just gonna grow right back, right? So, hoeing or physically pulling a nutsedge, a perennial, is not gonna do the same thing as crabgrass. But if all you have is crabgrass, then great, don't worry about it. Just pull it and be done with it and walk on. So it's really, really important to be able to identify your weeds and use the apps. That will be the best thing for you. Okay, so why do you have weeds? Why do some people have really, really bad weeds and some people don't have as many weeds? Like, for instance, knock on wood, I don't want to jinx myself. Here in my garden, I do not have very many weeds. And I think I know why. The person who owned my house before I moved in, there was a period of time where she had let the garden go and the weeds got, waist high. All my neighbors have told me, and they've all complained about it and said what a horrible, horrible situation it was. But before she sold the house, she actually invested in landscaping and put landscape fabric literally everywhere. Literally everywhere in my garden, right? So it killed all the weeds, the weed seeds that were sitting dormant in the ground. It killed them. Well, they're probably still dormant in the ground, but it killed enough of them so that I really don't have a problem with weeds as of right now. That might change. I don't know. But think about maybe somebody who lives down the street from me, or like there's a community garden on the corner. There's weeds everywhere in that garden, right? And you have to think, okay, well, why does this person have a weed problem and this person doesn't? And there's many reasons why it could be. Some to think of is, are you overwatering? Are you overwatering your lawn? Are you overwatering a part of your garden? Something like a nutsedge, which is that perennial really bad one, they love overwatered conditions. They can thrive more than other plants in overwatered conditions. So if you have a lot of nutsedge, you might be overwatering. And so once you identify that you're inundated with nutsedge, one of the first things you need to think of is, okay, am I watering too much? It's allowing this nutsedge to thrive here, right? Another thing is you might have compact or bare soils, right? Bare soils, I had landscape fabric. Spurge can grow really well in compacted soils, right? So it might be something you might need to, if you need to work in a certain area, or there's a certain area of your garden that you don't garden in because you get spurge all the time, you might need to just go in there and cultivate up the soil a little bit, just so the spurge doesn't thrive in those compacted soils and outcompete other plants that can't thrive in those compacted soils. If you have low soil nitrogen, that's where clover can thrive. These are just examples. These are not the only options, right? Thin areas and grass lawns and lawns mowed too short. I didn't write down what weed it was, but there's certain weeds that grow low, right? So if you mow your lawn, like say 1 inch tall, there is a certain type of weed that only grows to 1 inch tall, right? And so that weed is going to start taking over, and it's going to be thriving in that 1 inch tall grass, right? Because it's getting enough sun, because your grass, you mow your grass too short, basically. If you only mowed your grass to 3 inches tall, that 1 inch tall weed is going to be shaded out and it's not going to thrive, right? So it's something to think about. What are you doing in your garden that might be encouraging these weeds to grow, where you don't want them to? All right. So you've identified the weed problem that you have in your garden. You kind of might have an idea of why you have that weed problem. Maybe you have really compacted soils, or maybe, you've been overwatering your grass a little too much, or whatever it is, right? So how are you going to manage it? And the first thing I have to say is this is going to be very general, because the best way to figure out the management strategies is to go look up that specific weed that you're having a problem with and actually read about the specific weed, because there are so many, and there are so many different ways to manage it. So the first thing for management is prevention. It's always prevention. It's always going to be prevention. So know the source that you're getting your mulch from, right? If you do that chip drop, you got to know that there might be some weeds in that chip drop mixed in with that chip drop, right? It's free, great, awesome, but there might be some weeds mixed in with it. If you get, a whole bunch of soil from somebody who's selling it for free on Craigslist, like that is not a trusted source. So just be prepared that there might be some weeds mixed in. Most reputable garden centers will sell you good stuff that doesn't have weed seeds in it and all that kind of stuff. So know your source and trust that source. That it's not going to bring any weeds, but it's also not going to bring any viruses and any bad insects, right? That can be a problem as well. Then you want to encourage rapid establishment of plants. This is something that they definitely talked about, and this is what I've been talking a lot about soil temperature, because I am past my last frost date, but my soil temperature has not warmed up quite yet in my garden. And so if I planted out certain plants into my garden that had low soil temperature, too low for that plant is just going to sit there, and they're just going to be babies sitting there, and they're going to be struggling, and it's going to give the weeds opportunities to grow up while that plant is sitting there struggling. So what you want to do is you want to encourage rapid establishment, planting at the right time, making sure that plant has plenty of water, plenty of sun, plenty of nutrition. If you have a really hard time, like say you have a veggie garden and you cannot direct seed because the weeds just basically take over, it might be something to think about, that you might want to start with transplants, right? Because transplants are going to have a huge advantage over the weed seeds, right? And the transplants might get big enough that they will outcompete the weed seeds. So make sure that you have rapid establishment of your desired plants. And then finally, exclusion, which is prevent weed growth in hard to reach locations. This would be where you would use something like rocks, landscape fabric, or concrete. All right, then on to the tough stuff that I'm sure a lot of you are watching this video about this part. And I don't want to disappoint you, but go look up your specific weed, right? That's kind of what I want to say. So you can do cultivation, which is like mowing, trimming, hand pulling, right? You're physically dealing with the weed. And again, if you're dealing with an annual weed, great, awesome, cool, right? You've taken care of the problem. If you're dealing with a perennial weed, nope, you just wasted some time there. I'm not saying you wasted time, but it's not the only thing that you have to do. There is one thing that they did talk about, and this was called solarization. So say you have a plot of land and you cannot deal with the weeds that you have in that plot of land. It like my flower field, right? They just keep coming back and you don't know what to do with it. So there is a technique that they encourage, and by they, I mean the weed scientists. And basically what they say is first you want to cultivate the area. So first you want to take all the current weeds out, and you actually want to hoe or cultivate, dig up the first inch of soil that you have in that garden bed. Just an inch, right? Really less than an inch. Then you want to level it all out nice and flat. Then you want to water it. You want to water that newly cultivated soil. And what you're doing is you're encouraging all those dormant weeds to grow. All the seeds that were in that seed bed, that were in that first inch of soil, you want them all to grow, right? And then what you do is you take clear plastic and you put clear plastic over it and you leave it. You leave it and you let those weeds start growing, and then they're gonna die because the UV rays get through that clear plastic, it heats them up and it basically burns them to death or heats them to death. And then what you're doing is you're killing all the weed seeds that are lying dormant in that piece of property. This is not an easy technique. Like, I am not going to do this on my flower field. That one, it'll take way too long for this season, and two, I don't want to deal with all that plastic and hoeing, and I just don't want to deal with all of that. But that is a technique that they recommend. It is something that they people definitely do, and it is called solarization, and that is how people do deal with weeds in a certain plot of land. And then the other part of managing weeds that we all know about is the use of herbicides. And there are organic herbicides and there are synthetic herbicides. And we all know, I can never say this word right, like glyphosate, Roundup, basically. I have decided that I'm not going to talk about that on my channel. And the main reason is because I don't want any mean comments, basically. I am a new master gardener. I am just learning this information. I am just expressing the information that I've learned from my master gardener's training class with you guys. And, I don't want to get into it in the comment section because I am just learning it myself, right? So I want to encourage you guys, if you want to see what the Master Gardeners program has to say, go check out this UC IPM website. Just remember that there are, when you look up studies, there are studies that are based off of science institutions, universities, and then there are other studies that are have ulterior motives, right? That are not done by science-backed institutions. So just something to think about, but I've decided not to approach it. I've already gotten burned a couple times on some things that I've said in these past videos. So I apologize if you guys were waiting to see what I had to say about that, but I've just made the decision that, I am just too new at this, and I don't think people understand that these are just recaps. These are not my opinion. These are just me telling you guys what I learned in class. So that being said, let's move on to a couple common weeds that are at least in my area, California. Okay, so let's go over some common weeds. They are common here in California, but I know they're common in other places as well. So when you guys see these, you might see and be like, oh yeah, we have those. Oh, we have those. Now that I've put a name to a face or a name to a weed, I see them everywhere. My family and I were driving the other day around town, and I was saying, there's a mallow, there's a radish, there's a mustard, right? And I could just identify them all. It was really, really cool. But like I was saying, I think I've said this enough. You have to know what you're dealing with to be able to treat it appropriately. Also, you kind of have to know before it gets to the point where it's too late, right? So take, for example, a dandelion, probably one of the most common weeds that we see. I know the dandelion based on the pretty little flower, the yellow flower. And then once it goes to the seed head, that's the one that you blow and make a wish. Really cute. You're spreading the weeds all over the place when you do that, but that's okay. But, this is actually a perennial, so it doesn't just reproduce by the seeds. It does reproduce by the roots as well, but that's for another story. You want to be able to identify the dandelion by its leaves as well before it actually flowers, so that you know what you're dealing with. And the way that you can identify the dandelion is all the leaves are growing from the same spot. It's called basal leaf growth. It doesn't have stems or petioles. All the leaves come from one spot. So that's a dandelion. Then we have prickly lettuce. And the way that you can identify this is, one, it kind of looks like lettuce, right? And then the other thing is, the stem, the petiole is absent. It's the same thing as a dandelion. There's no stem, the leaves just grow from the ground. And prickly lettuce does have those serrated leaves, and serrated leaves means kind of like teeth, right? So then we have mallow, and mallow is one that I actually find really pretty. I think it's a really, really pretty weed, but it is a weed and it will take over and outcompete other plants. But mallow is identified by the leaf. It has more of a rounded shaped leaf. And then something to always know about mallow, to know that it's mallow and not like, I don't know, it kind of looks like a geranium leaf to me as well, is that the stem or the petiole is always longer than the leaf. So if you're going to fold the leaf back on the stem will always be longer than the leaf. And that is a identifying characteristic of mallow. This is a winter annual, so it's up and all over the place and growing beautifully for us right now. But once the heat comes, it's gonna die back, and you're not gonna have to worry about it anymore. Then let's see, we have yellow nutsedge. So yellow nutsedge is a perennial that is dormant in winter. So you're not going to see it in the winter, right? And so there's no point to treat it in the winter time and think like, oh, I don't have nutsedge anymore. But then it's going to come in the summer, right? And you're going to say, oh, well, there's my nutsedge, and that's why. Let's see, spotted spurge. One of the things, the big indicators of spotted spurge is that it does have milky sap. So it's really easy when you find a defining characteristic to these weeds. It's really easy to see. Like a dandelion, the defining characteristic is the yellow flower. Spotted spurge, it has milky sap in its leaves with red spots. It's a summer annual, so there's no point to treat it now. You want to treat it in the summertime when it's coming out. Same with crabgrass. Crabgrass is a summer annual as well. So there's a whole bunch of them, a lot of really interesting ones. Wild radish is beautiful. It has white and purple flowers. That's up all over the place right now. Mustard, beautiful, right? But they're all weedy plants, and the seeds will stay dormant for a really long time. And then when you have a rainy winter like we do, it's absolutely crazy. So let me show you guys a clip right here of this beautiful field of mustard, but it's a beautiful field of weeds. So it's good to know what you're dealing with, just so that you know kind of how to handle it. So anyway, let me know if you guys have any questions about weed identification and weed management. I know this wasn't a ton of discussion about weed management, but that's how my Master Gardener's class was. It was probably 3.5 hours of weed identification and all about weeds and the life cycle of weeds and reproductive cycle of weeds and on and on and on, and maybe only a half an hour about management, because it is so varied. Management for weeds is so varied, and it really depends on what type of weed you're dealing with. So I hope that makes sense. But now that I've kind of gone through it and I've learned certain weeds, I feel a lot better about managing weeds that I have in my garden, and know how to do it, and know certain techniques that I do, like maybe not water this area, to kill certain water loving weeds or something like that. I feel a lot more confident when I do see a weed. I'll be able to figure out exactly what to do with it. So anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this. There will not be a Master Gardener's recap next week. We are actually off next week because, is it next week? Yeah, it is next week, because of Cesar Chavez Day. So that is a holiday for us. It's Cesar Chavez Day, so there will be no recap next week. But I do have some really fun proven winter planting videos next week, so it's actually perfect timing. So, and then after that, I think is houseplants is the next, which is exciting as well. So we are coming to the end of this, you guys. I am almost done. It flew by. It absolutely flew by. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you all have a chance to get in your garden today.